Ooh.
Go ahead.
Welcome to a much anticipated Zoom session here in Elaine. With me are the president of the Elaine Legacy Center and the vice president of the Elaine Legacy Center. I'm one of the co-directors and I'm Mary Olson. We all welcome you to this Zoom. Dr. Carruthers has been key to us. She's key to the reason we are starting in 1 week or 2 weeks at the most, the restoration of the museum. With her is Wendell Griffen, who is also extremely helpful to us and to justice issues across the world. We read his blogs, we read his newspaper, we needle him to say some words about us on his radio program. From Arkansas, he's known as Mr. Justice. We are thankful that he is moderating today.
Thank you, Dr. Olson, and welcome everyone. We are blessed to have this time to have a conversation with Dr. Iva Elaine Carruthers, and I want to acknowledge the presence of people from around the world. I will acknowledge the presence of our dear brother Alan Buzak from South Africa, Dr. Buzak, of course, the presence of Dr. Jeremiah Wright, one of the co-founders of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, and we acknowledge the presence of Julia Wright, a daughter of Richard Wright. Dr. Carruthers, Julia Wright sends her regards and says she's glad to be able to welcome another co-descendant of Elaine. Let me share some few words of introduction and get right to it. Dr. Iva E for Elaine Carruthers is a founding trustee and general secretary of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, an interdenominational organization within the African American faith tradition focused on social justice issues. The Proctor Conference is both a 501c3 and a United Nations Non-Governmental Organization, NGO. Dr. Carruthers has steered the Proctor Conference as a unique, influential, and esteemed global network of faith-based advocates, activists, clergy, and laypersons. Dr. Carruthers has a long history of engagement in community development initiatives and social justice ministry, fostering interfaith and racial reparatory justice dialogue in the United States, the Caribbean, South America, Asia, and Africa. She is Professor Emeritus and former Chairperson of the Department of Sociology at Northeastern Illinois University and founding President of Nexus Unlimited, an information and technology firm. She is also founder of Lois House, an urban retreat center in Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Carruthers currently serves on several boards, including that of American Baptist College in Nashville, Tennessee, Bread for the World in Washington, D.C., and is a member of the National African American Reparations Commission. She is also a lifetime trustee of Chicago Theological Seminary. Dr. Carruthers has authored and edited numerous articles and publications in the areas of religion, sociology, and digital technology. She served as co-producer of educational television programs, was a delegate to the 2001 UN World Conference Against Racism, was appointed to the White House Advisory Council on the Internet, National Information Infrastructure Mega Project, and the educational software that she developed was awarded a Computer World Smithsonian Award. She holds degrees from the University of Illinois, Northwestern University, Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, and Meadville Lombard Theological School, and is the recipient of many awards. Thanks to her leadership and as part of its Sacred Memory Project, the Proctor Conference held a Truth-Telling Commission hearing in Elaine, Arkansas on February the 8th, 2019, 2 years ago, at the Elaine Legacy Center. Elaine, Arkansas is the site of one of the most bloody and horrific massacres in American history, where upwards of 200 African Americans, men, women, and children, were killed between September 30 and October 2 in 1919. Dr. Carruthers declares that the culture of this country has resulted in too many African Americans being crippled by self-hatred and shame. And part of that shame is because their history has never been told. Quoting her, history has ignored the stories of Black people, Dr. Carruthers shares. She says, we hear what amounts to sound bites from time to time, especially during Black History Month. But the rich history of African Americans, including the stories of our faith, our tenacity, and our role in making America what it is today, is largely ignored. Our Sacred Memory Project targets that shortcoming in our country. We want and need Black people to know who we are and what we have done, close quote. Dr. Carruthers affirms that Black people and other people of color in this country can never afford to rest, because the people who run the country have a vested interest in keeping the truth hidden. Dr. Carruthers, thank you for making time to speak with us today. As I've mentioned, our audience is a worldwide one, spanning at least 3 continents, North America, Europe, and Africa. And so to begin, let me simply say welcome, and let me give you a chance to give an opening greeting and response, and now begin to ask you some questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Judge Wendell, for that gracious introduction. But much more than that, I also want to thank the Elaine Legacy Center for convening this conversation. I did not know, Judge Griffen, until you really began to do that introduction, how much my heart would be filled with joy and sorrow as I reflected on why we are having this conversation. I am named after my grandmother, Iva McMurray Banks. And it occurred to me as I anticipate this conversation that she is in the room with me. And so I want to begin by just welcoming the ancestor of my grandmother and my grandparents and my parents. And let us begin.
Dr. Carruthers, how did the Elaine Massacre affect your family history?
Well, it certainly affected it in that it fractured, probably upon fractures, a family that was close-knit, that largely lived in the Little Rock area and surrounding small towns such as Woodson and Gessamine, and those places that you and I have talked about fondly, and some of those places I have even dared to come and visit and walk the paths of. But the Elaine Massacre just contributed to what I grew up knowing as a family history that was often divided around where people could find employment, incidences of violence where people fled, divisions within the family that resulted in some coming up north and some staying down south, often never to be heard again for generations, and coming back together again. But certainly the Elaine Massacre impacted greatly on the fact, in answer to your question, that's how we got to Brazil.
Yeah, this conversation is titled, "We Ended Up in Brazil."
Mm-hmm.
And so it is appropriate for me to ask, when did you realize the connection between your family presence in Brazil and the history of racialized violence in Arkansas that included the Elaine Massacre?
Well, I would say that we had three clusters of geographical location within our family. One was the Chicago area. Well, actually there were four. The other was Washington, DC. There was certainly Little Rock, Arkansas. And then there was a group of a couple of brothers who ended up in Michigan. And the family in Michigan was probably the one that was most isolated from the others. But I grew up understanding that our family had been dispersed in those geographical areas. And that one of the narratives was our great uncle who had migrated to Brazil. And the reality of the significance of that occurred for me for real in 1968. It was certainly a part of our family narrative that there was family in Brazil. But in 1968, my generations, my cousin, Sueli, who in African tradition would be my sister by generation, ended up marrying someone who was a diplomat in Brazil representing Nigeria. And Sueli and her husband got assigned to the United States. And she came to the United States as a diplomat's wife. She was an attorney. And the result of that is that she met my great aunts who resided in Washington, DC. And from that moment on, I think there have been 4 generations of us who make sure that we take that trek back and forth every year. So I had my great uncle who was the expatriate. I have known of 2 of his sisters who got to reconnect with that family actually in Brazil. One who was very afraid of flying, but she wanted to go so much that she and her husband went on a steamer and right after Sueli and our family reunited. So that's when I became fully aware of the fullest implication of what had happened. It was then beyond just a family narrative that I grew up with, but it became full-fledged. And my cousin sister Sueli, actually, their 2 children were born in the United States, so they hold 3 citizenships of US, Nigerian, and Brazilian.
How did the knowledge of that racialized violence, and specifically the Elaine Massacre, affect your sense of self and your sense of purpose and your perspectives on justice?
Well, I think if I had to mark a global bookend, it would be that against a very personal bookend in the United States, and it would be Emmett Till's assassination, murder, recovery. I was 10 years old when that happened, and that certainly solidified what I had experienced as the worst of racism, Northern style. Juxtaposed, of course, when I came down home where you were, Wendell, and I remember the first time I came as an adolescent, that I thought I could walk in the front door of the movie theater, and all my cousins pulled me back and told me we had to go upstairs and so forth and so on. And, you know, that dissonance I had to process and resist. And so that part of the story in terms of Emmett Till was one narrative that shaped me. But certainly understanding that and hearing the story of a great uncle who at the time had an excellent job. He was a mail carrier in the environs of Elaine and Little Rock. A white woman had demanded that he sell her a stamp or take this letter, and he refused to do so because there had been a newly passed legislation that you could only touch mail that was in mailboxes. She then said, "Boy, you will do what I say." He said, "I'm not going to do that." And she accused him of assault, and he had to literally defend himself in court. And as I understand it, he was very relieved to have been able to argue his case. My grandmother would tell the story that he came home, and the next thing she knew, he was packing up his family, and he says, "I'm out of here." And she had not heard from him for years. And then fast forward, I have a copy of the letter that he responded back to her in 1930. That was in part response to a letter that he had received from my grandmother in 1922. And they had found each other, and it began a correspondence between some of the children.
An accusation that he had disrespected a woman for refusing to sell her a stamp when that was against the rules, and he has to go to court, and in that environment, he was wary of his safety, even in.
Yeah, there was a threat of lynching. This was in the backdrop of the Elaine riots. We know that because in the magazine articles, including the Little Rock Times, the newspaper article, and the magazine article that was done in Ebony in 1964, as well as a letter from one of the journalists who had interviewed him in Brazil. He mentioned this was all in the backdrop of the Elaine massacre.
Why are you continuing to advocate for more truth-telling about the Elaine race massacre of 1919?
Well, certainly because of my personal narrative, as well as my privilege to professionally have effectively been able to work as a technologist and in some ways as a religious leader and theologian and as an educator. I have no choice. I stand on the blood, sweat, and tears of my 4 parents who have gone before and who have shared so much. When I thought about my grandmother at the opening of this conversation, I always remembered being able, we lived in an extended family situation, see her work crossword puzzles as a way to affirm her quest for excellence in education. And she managed to see me receive my master's degree. I was in the process of getting my PhD, but she left me some words of wisdom I'll never forget. One was, honey, I've seen you get your BS, which you know what that can mean. I want you to understand that MS means mule, and a PhD, I may not get to see you get it, but just believe me that that can also mean how high deep. And so whatever you do, do not forget your CS, which is common sense. And so common sense teaches me what Leo Hansberry said, those who do not know their history will walk around the world as a vagabond. And so I have an obligation to tell the story. Papa Dallas, one of the former slaves, they found his interview as a part of the WPA project, telling the story of how his eyes were burned out because of his, quote, masters putting cigarette butts in his eyes for being resistant to a command. And his niece started crying as she heard the story. And he said, daughter, don't cry for me. Just remember to tell my story. Do not cry, just remember to tell my story. And so it's very easy for me to wake up every day and ask, how will I contribute to telling that story? I do so as General Secretary of Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, understanding that he represented the excellence in the academy and the church and the community, and went to Africa to head up the Peace Corps. So it's very easy for me to continue and be committed to creating spaces and processes by which that story is told.
Thank you for telling the story and telling it with such poignancy and such grace. What remembrances, Dr. Carruthers, do you have about the human toll and the human trauma that racialized violence has upon the human spirit, and specifically on African-American families?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can share that answer specifically in relationship to my family, I think in two ways. One would be to understand the first exchange I had in Brazil with my Aunt Kathleen. And then as she and I became closer and she took several trips here and I there, the exchange around her remembrances of what was told to her. Her mother said that when their father came home and decided they would leave, he told his wife, Aunt Sadie, that she could take two things with her, only two. There would only be two items that she could bring. And those two items was a vase, which we have in the family. It is in Brazil. And the other was a book, which I want to share with you. I think Tiana is here. Are you going to share it for me, Tiana? Yep. And I think it speaks to both the healing balm of the trauma, as well as what the trauma represents. So as it turns out, the powerful moment that I remember about that was that she gave these items to me as a way to make sure they stayed and remained in the family. So Gospel Pearls, which you know is the book of the National Baptist Convention.
I have my mama's Gospel Pearls, yes.
Was one of the items that my great aunt selected. And then my Aunt Kathleen in 2001 presented this and said, "This belonged to my father, Frank, and Mother Sadie McMurray, with love, from Kathleen." And so I cherish those remembrances, but I cherish them with an understanding of the trauma and what that meant. This was the same Aunt Kathleen who talked to me about her father, my great uncle, banning them from speaking English ever again in the family house. So she only got to retain and practice her English when her father was not home. Although he, among other things, bought land and had a fruit farm as well as a language school, I understand, because there were so many sailors coming in and out. That was one of the ways that he generated income. But he was so much against what the United States represented in English that he banned them from speaking English. And that was one of the traumas that stayed with Aunt Kathleen until she died in her 90s, because she always apologized for her inability to speak English. She also wondered how her life would have been different had she been able to grow up with my mother, her cousin Lois, who they became so very, very close. Then another way that trauma was experienced, and we were blessed to be able to, in some ways, heal from it, had to do with my first visit to Brazil, in which I only knew Sueli by name, but I told her I was coming. She was a practicing attorney. She said that she had a time to meet with me for lunch because she was working and I was on a travel schedule. And so she told me to meet her in the square downtown. We met downtown Rio in a square. We kind of stood up and hugged and talked the whole time. And she just parenthetically said something like, you know, if there was any one thing I would want to do, it would be to come to the States with the children. Because I have nothing to give them other than an opportunity for education, and they cannot get the kind of education they need here that I would want them to have. And I said, well, what do you have to do? And she said, well, we need a sponsor. And I said, oh, I'll sponsor you. She said, you'll sponsor me? I said, sure. I said, you know, I go all over Africa signing these sheets of paper, sponsoring folks. Certainly I can sponsor my family. And so within that hour, we had worked this out. I came back, I got the paperwork, sponsored them. And Sueli came with her 2 children. They were at the time in middle school and junior high, and she looked them straight in the eye. She said, let me be real clear. I am a lawyer, but I am not going to do anything around practicing law. I am strategically going to become a secretary clerk in the international school in Washington, D.C., so that I can get free tuition for you. I have no money. All I have for you is an opportunity for education. And so I want you to take advantage of that and to know that. And she worked 3 jobs as a school clerk. She worked part-time as a gift in a gift shop, and she translated for those who needed translations done. Her 2 children, one became a senior scholar at Harvard University and went through the law school, and her son finished West Point and is now a commander in Italy over the COVID-19 implementation. And so it is a story of trauma and resilience. It is a story of God's presence, always forever with us. It is a personal, and it is a story that speaks to our people. And the fact that, as Reverend Wright would say, it was no ocean that enslaved us. So, you know, it was not about the transatlantic slave trade. It was the vehicle was the transatlantic across the river on some boats. But those boats were connected to a system, a transatlantic slave trade system in which we were enslaved, and in which we know the God at the top of that boat was not the same God that was prayed for and made petitions to at the bottom of the boat. And so it is orchestrated and ordered my steps to fully appreciate the role of Pan-Africanism and the need for us to connect the dots between our narratives as people of African descent.
You have led naturally into the next question, but before I ask it, I made a note that your cousin Kathleen's father banned them from speaking English. And I was thinking about the narratives, and you recall it from the Truth Commission session we had in February at Elaine in 2019, where the sister from Elaine testified so clearly about the elders told them, we don't talk about,
Right.
we don't talk about the massacre.
Right.
And people argue about why there is no written history, but the white press prohibited the truth from being told and published lies, and then threatened Black people to even talk about, even gather. And so when I heard you talk about your aunt, your cousin Kathleen's telling her family, don't talk about English because of the impact of the racialized violence that was responsible for their family going to Brazil from the US, I was thinking, oh, how much we have gone through, and as you mentioned, how great our resilience has been.
And often it has been grounded in a silence of suffering.
Yes.
And that's what you're speaking to. It was because of what you just spoke to that as we creatively thought about how we told that story, if you remember, we named our documentary of that Truth-Telling Commission Hush Mouth. Yes. Because in fact, the whites had told the Black community that they should hush mouth, not speak of this ever again. We even have a copy of the poster that they put up all over the town of Elaine, telling you don't talk about this. And in some ways, that's a natural response to psychological trauma, right? You bury it in the recesses of your memory, whatever kind of trauma it can be, individual and or collectively. And so you don't talk about it, thinking that by not speaking of it, it does not exist. And so that veil of denial, but we've got to pierce that veil and tell the truth, and tell the truth with righteous authority and indignation. And that's what we are committed to doing.
When you were talking about that, I recalled a family reunion on my father's side that my wife and I hosted in Little Rock of our relatives from around the country. And we were gathered at the house the night that the jury verdict came in the Trayvon Martin case. And there was a conversation among the elders about whether or not we needed to talk about that verdict. And there was some who said, no, we're here for a family reunion. And there was other views, no, we will talk about it because we want the young ones to talk about it. And during the conversation, my brother, I'll say this very quickly, who is 3 or 4 years younger than I am, shared something that I had not known. We both had played basketball for our high school team. He was a better basketball player than I was several years later. But because we didn't have a car, he had to walk from the school in town to home, 2.5 miles away in the country. And he spoke about being run off the road by white folks as he was walking home from basketball practice, but he never told mama or daddy and never told my sister and me until that night. And so he had kept that secret for 40 years. And so what your cousin Kathleen told about her father, what the people of Elaine heard about Hushmouth, what my brother Danny said was very, very real. And that's all part of our sacred memories that we have to get through.
Right. Because right now, as we sit here, we have McGraw-Hill. In fact, I used to be a chief consultant for McGraw-Hill for K through 12 textbooks around ethnic, quote, diversity and inclusion. Yet it's McGraw-Hill who succumbed to the demands of Texas and Florida and California right wing, demanding that the textbooks play down the role of enslavement, but rather create the narrative that people of African descent came to this country under the guise of immigration with an I, and came as agricultural workers. And so right now, McGraw-Hill high schools, middle school textbooks are telling the narrative of our experience under immigration and agricultural workers. And when those 3 states who represent the control over that market make you do that, then you can rest assured that those textbooks will be around for the next 10 years, impacting generations of young people's understanding of their own self-history. And that's why the church is called to be a sacred space, to be an independent space, to tell the truth and to sustain the story and the narratives that we must know. That is so very, very critical. And at the same time, those who can't spell critical race theory are now passing legislation that says you cannot teach critical race theory. And that, of course, includes even Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech.
Yeah. Dr. Carruthers, you have a powerful family narrative that you've already shared. How has your personal family narrative impacted your, guided your teaching and your ministry as a Pan-African scholar and activist and theologian?
Well, certainly I must honor in our midst Reverend Dr. Jeremiah E. Wright Jr., whose influence on me as a theologian, religious scholar, and a woman of faith made it very clear to me about whose I was. And I would also likewise acknowledge the role that John Henry Clark, as a Pan-African historian and elder, became a mentor to me to help shape my identity as a Pan-African scholar. For me, it was embracing the question of who are we? How do we connect? How do we penetrate and dismantle those barriers that were the consequences of the transatlantic slave trade? And coming to the realization, the extent to which language is such a barrier and gets in the way. It gets in the way for two reasons. One, because we can't speak each other's language. But secondly, the texture, the richness of African thought, African epistemology, African ways of knowing, African ways of expression is very different than the texture and the flatness of a Western European linear view. And so language becomes very important. And it was for that reason that as I began to see that people of African descent around the world shared the same experiences, but had different cultural contexts in which those experiences were being lived, there was a need for us, an imperative for us to connect those dots. That became crystal clear around the Durban meeting, in which we were embracing a strategy using the international codes of law, which said that something, quote, that had been deemed to be a crime against humanity would position you for a claim for reparations. And so there was much intentionality among scholars and ethicists from around the world to create a collective declaration that the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade system, was a crime against humanity. And as you might remember, Colin Powell at the time was the lead voice for making sure the United States did not participate in that Durban meeting.
He was Secretary of State at the time.
He was Secretary of State. I did a piece on the church and reparations through the resources and support from Trinity United Church of Christ and Dr. Wright, and then from the denomination called the Church and Reparations, and we translated it into 3 languages, Portuguese, Spanish, and French, and English, of course. And I realized in then getting the responses, particularly from Brazil, around the importance of us being able to translate our works in colonial languages that allowed us to connect the dots was an important part of the research that we had to do. And so that experience, along with having had the privilege of studying with Sheikh Anta Diop, and the first time I met Dr. Diop, he knew no English, and I knew a little bit of French. And I was trying to translate some of what he was saying to the group that I was with, that I had brought as students and others. And then Carlos Moore, who grew up in Cuba, walked in and started taking over the translation. Before Diop died, he mastered English. But the point is that we had a body of knowledge about our people that was being held hostage by these language barriers. And so I think one of the most important things we can do is attend to language and attend to how we not force fit our experience into European constructs and words, but that we attempt to grapple with the implications of African constructs, even if it makes us uncomfortable, because we have to learn what Ubuntu means, right? We have to learn what it means to consider Ujamaa in the context of a communal notion and understand what that looks like for us, even now in Elaine, Arkansas, where there's something about what it means to know that I am because you are.
In that sense, Dr. Carruthers, you have a body of work, the work you did on reparations, and thanks to Dr. Wright and Trinity for publishing that. And that is a testimony to Dr. Wright's prophetic leadership. And I say that knowing he is hearing us, and I do it intentionally. Dr. Wright, I'm not trying to do anything except give you credit for what credit's due. God bless you. And given the body of work you've done, Dr. Carruthers, in this area, what lessons and observations about race, color, and gender from the lens of your family history would you share with us on this platform in this conversation?
Okay, that's an important question. It's a deep question, and there are multiple answers to it. I'll just throw out a few. One of the things that I'm reminded of when the Ebony Story in 1964 came out, it was quite an article. I mean, I think it was 6 or 7 pages. Interestingly enough, the title of that article was Will Amalgamation Work in Brazil? So the framework for solution to the quote race question was amalgamation or miscegenation.
Yeah.
In other words, the bleaching out of the race would be an answer to the creation of a democracy as a manifestation of justice for all, okay? That juxtaposed against a controlled environment of a separation of people of different racial backgrounds through geographic segregation. It's interesting that in that article, and it was an attempt to get the collective narratives of the Blacks who had left the United States and come to Brazil, as well as some who left Brazil and went back to Africa. But one of the narratives was that, and my great uncle expressed this, he felt that there was a sense of freedom in Brazil that he never knew in the United States. It was not to deny the fact that there were not problems in Brazil, but they were not the problems based, in his view, on this racialized color thing. Now, that is absolutely not true. I mean, Brazil is, I used to call it the second to South Africa. But what those who lived that experience said that South Africa would be on the scale of 80% and Brazil on the scale of 20%. And the mantra is, I'd rather live with dignity in Brazil than with wealth in the United States. And so one of the lessons learned is that we have got to be really clear about what it means to be human in relationship to skin color and phenotype and colorism, et cetera. That it is not just enough to make this an issue of Black and white. That there are the issues of colorism which must be addressed, and the extent to which that has been internalized by those who have been the victims, as well as those who have created these hegemonic systems of domination, that has got to be addressed. And so again, you know, let's just talk about Jeremiah, right? Everybody your kind ain't your color, right? Yeah. I mean, he says that all the time. And that's the whole point. I think the work of Alan Buzak, who is on, has taught us a whole lot about this question. So we got to get a clear understanding what is the North Star. That North Star has to be beyond phenotype. And that North Star beyond phenotype, in a situation in which we're now living in an age of the genome, meaning genotype, it's even more important that we're clear about what it means to be human and what that looks like in terms of the creation of communities, of ways in which we relate to each other, of ways in which we affirm God's presence and divinity within all of us. So that's one thing. In terms of gender, I am often accused, and I understand that, of not embracing feminism. In fact, that's okay. I think in the 25th anniversary of Ms. Magazine, I was called the greatest racist sociologist in the country because I challenged feminist constructs to define the reality of Black women. But I also raised a critique about embracing a womanist construct that was not intended for ethical theological reflection. And so if that construct was coming out of an understanding that there was something inherently competitive about Black male and Black female in relationship to movement building, I have and had a problem with that, using European terms to define that. In other words, I struggled with, rather than embracing feminism, I struggled with looking at the affirmation of understanding there is a difference between male and female spirit, energy, and personhood in African tradition, but those differences put us in a position of what I called appositional unity, as opposed to oppositional disunity. Because in my generation, the feminist movement was a movement intended to lure Black women away from being in relationship to Black men.
Right.
And Black men were not my enemy. Black men were not enslaving me. Black men were not creating these hegemonic systems that reflected. It did not mean that I did not see, understand, or experience Black male privilege in relationship to Black women and similar behaviors that represented, quote, sexism. But I was very clear from a Pan-African lens that Black men were not my enemy, and that I had more in common creating movement with Black men than I did with white women. That was my experience. That is my experience.
And you have done Black religion, and I should say you have done the Proctor Conference a good service by making sure that is part of the Proctor Conference perspective on Black theology and liberation. And I want to thank you for that.
Well, I hope so, but I don't think I've done it well enough, or we, more importantly, have done it well enough. I remember when James and Cecil were at odds over this very question. In fact, I think Cecil gets understated. I'm sorry, James and Cecil Cone. I think Cecil's work gets understated in terms of his contribution to James Cone's work on liberation theology, because Cecil critiqued James's lack of significant attention to what he called the African pre-understanding of theology that we came here with on those slave ships. And that until we reconnect those dots in terms of African understanding of what it means to be human, African understanding of God, African understanding of creations, etc., liberation theology would have a limitation on how it could help us, Black liberation theology. And so I think, and I see today that we as Black faith leaders want to walk to the door of African religious thought, but we don't want to go through it yet. And as a result of that, it is my view that we lose the power and authority and the benefit of ways of knowing and ways of being, because we too are suffering with the lure of amalgamation and miscegenation and thinking that white ice is colder.
Dr. Iva Elaine Carruthers, one of the founding trustees and the general secretary of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. Thank you so much for talking with me. Thank you for this conversation. I need to pitch to Dr. Mary Olson to give her a chance to talk about future events that the Elaine Legacy Center will be hosting, but I certainly don't want to do that before I thank the Elaine Legacy Center for asking Dr. Carruthers to speak about the relationship that her family has personally to the Elaine Massacre and how the Elaine Massacre has impacted her family's trajectory and her own ministry. Thank you, Dr. Carruthers, for doing so profoundly. Thank you, Dr. Olson, for making this opportunity available. And thank you, audience, for being here on this platform with us. Dr. Olson, I will pitch it to you now for announcements and anything else you want to share. You are
Thank
unmuted.
you. Thank you, Judge Griffen, for such a great job of monitoring. Thanks, Dr. Carruthers, for expanding our own thoughts. I'm sure we at Elaine, and we're at several different computers here, but I'm sure we'll all leave here thinking that, you know, we haven't thought enough about how what happened here sent people from Arkansas everywhere elsewhere, and probably even in the country elsewhere. So we've thought too small, and so you've helped us. This series that started on your vision for the Truth-Seeking Commission hearing is expanded. We thought a lot about land ownership and land theft to start out with. And then we thought of other professionals here, for we are very adamant that not everybody here was a sharecropper. And now we think of broader yet movement in the country. I want to be sure everybody who has heard any of these, or if anybody's missed it, share with your friends, that on Sunday, November 28th at 4 p.m. Central Time, Julia Wright will be with Judge Griffen speaking about Richard Wright's Elaine. Richard Wright gives us the best description of anybody succinctly anywhere in chapter 2 of the Elaine of the early 20th to 1900s, where it was a place to be. Everybody wanted to come if you were African American, because you could own land here, you could make a good income, you could be professional, you could have a chance. And the worst racism anybody will ever experience, the worst racial terror, the worst racial injustice, all as a microcosm of the world in Elaine. She will be speaking on that at 4 o'clock Central Standard Time. She in her own right is a hero, speaking not only for the Elaine Massacre victims and descendants, but for all oppressed people. We here give thanks that we can say we know as a friend, Julia Wright. And then coming up next on February, now mark this, February 18th, it is a Friday. It is just before the Proctor Conference starts, so you want to mark that on your calendar too. Judge Wendell Griffen is keynoting for us the commemoration of the Moore versus Dempsey Supreme Court decision. The key decision under which all other decisions of civil rights are founded. And that will be both on Zoom and in person. So if you feel up to coming to Elaine, we welcome you to come to Elaine on February 18th from 10 to 2. We in Elaine are thankful that people are willing to give of themselves, share of themselves. Thank you.
Let me say this in closing. We are speaking about racialized violence on the eve of one trial, the trial of Cal Rittenhouse, which involved racialized violence, and during the process of another trial, the trial of the murderers of Ahmaud Arbery. And the subject we are talking about is as old as the history of Black people in this country and as current as current events. Dr. Carruthers, thank you. Dr. Olson, thank you. Elaine Legacy Center, thank you. Sisters and brothers,
Thank you.
let's keep the fire burning. Let's keep talking. Let's not do hush mouth. Let's say it loud. God be with you.
Amen.